Welcome to Policy Punchline. Here on the show, we interview scholars, policymakers, and business executives on frontier issues in our world today. I'm Maddie Feldman, co-president of Policy Punchline, and I'm joined by Eli Padoan. Marc J. Dunkelman is a fellow in international and public affairs at Brown University's Watson Institute, where his research explores the architecture of the American community and the evolution of political institutions. He's the author of a recently published book, congrats, called Why Nothing Works, Who Killed Progress, and How to Bring It Back, which examines the contours of modern-day American progressivism and explores how the growth of veto points and procedural guardrails has paralyzed U.S. capacity to build housing, infrastructure, and clean energy. His earlier book, The Vanishing Neighbor, The Transformation of American Community, analyzes the decline of middle-ring civic ties and its consequences for American politics and society. Beyond academia, Marc has spent 2 decades at the intersection of policy and governance. He has served as a senior fellow at the Clinton Foundation, worked at the Bipartisan Policy Center and the Democratic Leadership Council, and held senior staff roles in both chambers of Congress, including as legislative director and chief of staff in the House of Representatives and on the Senate Judiciary Committee. His writing has appeared in The Atlantic, Politico, and The Washington Post. Marc, thanks so much for joining us today.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. All right, Eli, I want to dive right in?
Absolutely. So please tell us if this is too personal a topic.
Yeah.
No problems at all. But we wanted to know what problems do you have with orchids?
What problems do I have with orchids? I don't claim to hate orchids. I can't say that I love them either. The issue is, and this comes from the talk yesterday, where I didn't know what an orchid was when I first came across it in a newspaper story. I thought it was some sort of bird or something. It turns out it's a flower. And maybe it's a very nice flower. I don't know. But I don't think that it should be the thing that stands in the way of us preventing climate change. How about that? Is that a reasonable reason to have a mixed, come see, come saw kind of a approach to orchids?
I think so, certainly.
Okay.
And before we dive into the meat of it, the meat of the stuff, do you take bigger issue with unseasoned quinoa or orchids?
Well, I take an issue with my wife forcing me to eat unseasoned quinoa. But these are the hard-hitting questions that I expected to come to Princeton to receive. So I'm glad we've gotten right to the meat of it. I feel like this is like a short and sweet podcast where you guys just get me with some zingers and then we move on. How does it work?
We have some tricks up our sleeve, you could say.
Okay, good.
But we can start with zooming out a little bit. We can explain to our viewers what exactly it is about orchids. Maybe talk a little bit about this philosophy of ethical, I think, moral sanctimony on one side of politics versus not actually getting stuff done.
Right.
Thoughts on that?
Well, the orchid story that I told yesterday at SPIA is sort of one subchapter of a longer saga about how Massachusetts in 2016 passed a law to green its grid, basically to replace the fossil fuel burning plants in its system with cleaner energy, and was going to do that by subsidizing both wind power generated off the Commonwealth's southern coast, so Vineyard Wind, a few other projects that are now in the news because Trump has halted them. And then they were going to grab a bunch of power from the dammed rivers in Quebec. Quebec in Canada had excess power that they were happy to sell to Massachusetts. The problem was that Massachusetts and Quebec don't have a border, and so the challenge was finding a way to get that power in Canada, in Quebec, down into basically Lewiston, Maine, which is sort of the northern border of the Massachusetts grid. So to get between Quebec and Lewiston, you needed to build a new transmission line. And this is a long story in my book, but the essence of it is the people between Quebec and Lewiston didn't want the line built because it was going to impair their views of the Kennebec Gorge or the Appalachian Trail, or it was going to come too close to their residential neighborhoods or whatnot. And so there was a lot of kvetching in Maine, often at the behest of environmentalists who were concerned that the line would cut through the sort of untouched northern woods of Maine, which are truly a treasure. And there were a whole series of explanations for why it seemed that the Avangrid, the power company, was wrong to do this, that the northern wood should be protected. And among the many, many barriers was a complaint that there was an endangered orchid species living in northern Maine, and that to build this power line through the grid might further endanger this orchid species. And so I use that because it's sort of this. It feels absurd, given that orchids are either birds or flowers, which it's still to be determined. It seemed absurd to make it so that we couldn't get the equivalent of 700,000 cars off the roads in Massachusetts and their carbon-emitting combustion engines in order to preserve this one flower. And so it sort of raises this question: should we, in the policymaking spaces in America, have a better way to be able to balance different goods against different costs, rather than saying any cost is too great no matter the benefit? Should we be trying to weigh these things? And in that process, that law was signed by Governor Charlie Baker, a Republican in Massachusetts, in 2016. We're getting close to 2026 now, and that line still has not yet been made operational. So it's sort of this remarkable example of how American policy making has veered off course, in my view, by becoming too procedurally caught up in vetocracy, and that we ought to be thinking about that more holistically, how we can balance these different goods.
We also wanted to mention your interview with Fareed Zakaria, where you spoke about how in 2012 Mike Bloomberg tried to bring the Olympics to New York City.
Yeah.
And one individual managed to sort of veto the entire process. To you, is this like a prime example of vetocracy in action?
Yeah. Well, that story, so Bloomberg wanted to bring the 2012 Olympics to New York. This is 2005. And just the way that power works in New York, this is, again, a long story that I tell in the book, but New York State, in an effort to curtail the potential for some sort of demonic figure like Robert Moses, who's the quintessential power broker. There's a book called The Power Broker by Robert Caro, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1974. He's a Princeton graduate, I believe. Tells the story of how this one sort of thought to be apolitical expert figure named Robert Moses coalesced a whole bunch of different hats, had lots of power in New York State between the 1930s and the 1960s, and was so powerful that powerless communities had no way to stop him from doing truly terrible things. And so in the wake of that, and in the wake of the Power Brokers publication in 1974, New York State embraced a whole series of policies that made it easy for people to stop bad projects. And that infrastructure, in that case it was a sort of a little-known bureaucracy called the Public Authorities Control Board, was freighted with the ability to veto any major capital expenditure if either the governor, the majority leader of the state Senate, or the House Assembly Speaker didn't like it. And in 2005, the Assembly Speaker was a guy named Shelley Silver, who would die in prison for corruption, but he had not yet been convicted. He was still in power. He was tied at the hip to folks who did not like the implications of building a new football or Olympic stadium on the west side of Manhattan. And so he vetoed the stadium proposal, despite the fact that it seemed like most New Yorkers supported it. Now, looking back, a lot of people will say that was a crazy idea, that we shouldn't have a football stadium for the New York Jets on the west side of Manhattan. There's already enough traffic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are better things to be done there. We can argue whether Hudson Yards, which is what has been erected in the place where that football stadium would have gone, was worth waiting for. But the point is that rather than allow sort of a democratic process to play out where everyone had a voice but no one had a veto, someone did have a veto here. And it made it impossible for Mike Bloomberg, who many people thought was a very successful mayor of New York, to impose his vision. And, of course, New York City lost the bid for the 2012 Olympics at that point, basically.
When you were first talking about vetocracy, my initial reaction was that in some cases, it feels like every individual, maybe in the Senate or other places, having a veto actually could create this credibility where everyone feels complicit in inaction so much as action, if every decision is conditional on working together to avoid vetoes in the first place. Is there any aspect of vetocracy that you think could facilitate this kind of humanitarian ethos?
Well, let's take that to just since we're talking about politics, like there was a time when the filibuster in the Senate was just sort of a mechanism to force senators who had an idea to get a support not just from 50 or from 49 or 50 of their colleagues, but a full 60 or 67. And so it's sort of the institution of the filibuster in a certain cultural moment or in a certain cultural setting was great because it would make it so that like it would force sort of bipartisan buy-in and you would force compromise and whatnot. And then the culture of the Senate changed. Getting to 60 or 67 votes became more difficult, but even more, people became less reticent to use this tool. Sort of, they call the nuclear option the effort to get around the filibuster, but really the filibuster itself is a nuclear option, right? And it got to be so easy to use that the Senate Majority Leader would call and see whether any of the 100 senators had an objection to a bill. And if they did, you were then in a spot where you needed 60 or 67 votes to meet cloture, which would bring it to a vote. So you sort of, rather than the filibuster being an outlying political institution to be used in emergency circumstances, it became the norm for senators to use the presumption that if they could just get a mere 32, 33, whatever it is, 40 members on their side, they could kill a bill that had majority support. Theoretically, you are right that if you have a social dynamic where everyone can shut everything down, it is an incentive to cooperate. And ideally, we would live in that kind of world. Unfortunately, in some cases, it seems like some people would rather fail to address a tragedy of the common than compromise on their position, even if it's worse off for them. And you see that in all sorts of circumstances, but it's particularly true in American politics now. Now, I think that goes back to my first book, which was about how communities changed in America, more than the second book, which is about how we sort of resolve differences institutionally. But there is sort of you're picking up on the fact that there is a sort of what are the sort of behavioral norms among a group of people? Like, are they inclined to, to object to something that lots of their colleagues support just because they can, or are they more inclined to get along? And do the procedural norms around how a decision is made enhance or denigrate the ability to come together in some sort of compromise?
You speak about one of your formative experiences being you reading that book that spoke about Robert Moses. Could you remind me of the name of the book one more time?
The Power Broker by Robert Caro. Yeah,
Robert Caro, Pulitzer Prize winning author. And you had this experience in Penn Station, and you were just thinking about how Robert Moses had been able to create all this change. Mm-hmm. And now, because of everyone's ability to veto this, veto that, no change is being made. So would you say that, on this spectrum, you also talk about the balance between, Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian mm-hmm. policy? Do you lean more towards having a central authority, or do you lean more towards people being able to veto and pushing the power down?
Yeah.
Because that experience to me seems like there's some part of you at least that would like some central authority to, in this case, fix up the MTA.
So it's a good question, and let me sort of walk back. The most famous story from the Power Broker, this 1974 book, is about the Cross Bronx Expressway, which was sort of Moses's most controversial project per that book. And it's in the 1950s, and the problem that New York confronted was that to get goods and services from Jersey and from most of the rest of the country to Long Island, there is no train. And so lots of trucks that were bringing goods and services to Brooklyn, Queens, and the two counties of Long Island, Nassau and Suffolk, were driving through Manhattan and causing terrible traffic. And so Robert Moses' solution to this problem is to build the Cross Bronx Expressway, which will then hook into the Throgs Neck Bridge, and therefore trucks will come, instead of across Manhattan, across this one expressway and get to Long Island. And the route that he chooses to take across the Bronx sort of winds its way through a bunch of working class communities. And those communities are all upset with his route. Most famously, there's Cairo focuses on a white Jewish working class community called East Tremont. And just the degree to which Moses was so powerful that when the residents of East Tremont complained, he didn't care at all. Like there was a way that he could have snaked the expressway so that it went sort of across the northern boundary of a park, and that would have saved lots and lots of apartment buildings. And he just refused to even consider it. And so the power of the Power Broker is that it articulates in such clarity the decimation of what happened in the South Bronx because of this expressway. And, the Power Broker comes out in 1974. In 1977, and there's a new book about this also, about there's a famous moment during the World Series, I think, where the announcer looks out over Yankee Stadium, which is in the Bronx, and sees a bunch of fires and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx is burning." And so, like at the moment, sort of in the 70s and 80s, there was this feeling that the urban wasteland, the Bronx was an urban wasteland, for better or worse, and whether that's fair or not, it's probably didn't seem fair to the people who still lived there, but that was the view, and that this highway was responsible for it, and that people had begged Moses not to build it. The mayor had been against it. Everyone had been against it, but Moses was so powerful that no one could stop him. I noticed then, reading The Power Broker on a train ride into New York City, that beginning in the 1980s, people had wanted to recreate Penn Station, which had once been the grandest entrance to New York City, the grandest train hall in the world, but had been demolished in the 1960s and sort of put underground. Now sits below Madison Square Garden, the world's most famous arena, but it was sort of this warren of sort of this rat's warren. There was an architecture, Vin Scully was an architecture professor at Yale for a long time, very famous guy who said, something to the effect of, we once entered the city like emperors and now we enter like rats. And in the 1980s, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a very powerful senator from New York State, had wanted to replace Penn Station with something better. And here it was, I was, probably 2011, 2012, I was coming into Penn Station on the train and realizing that years earlier I had read about these efforts to remake Penn Station and nothing had come of them. And I'm reading The Power Broker and I'm thinking to myself, how was it that Robert Moses in the 1950s was able to do this bad project despite everyone screaming no? And now here we are a few decades later, and no one can seem to accomplish this good project despite there being no sort of real natural opposition to making it a better Penn Station. And at the time, I had no idea. I didn't know how to answer that question. I had some sense, in New York sports fans hate, for some reason, well, I guess probably for good reason in many cases, the Dolan family, who own the Knicks and the Rangers and Madison Square Garden, largely because the Knicks have been terrible for a long time. Until last year, they looked pretty good. Anyway, my presumption at that time was that the Dolans were sort of the sand in the gears of getting this done, and it turned out as I read through it, that the Dolans were certainly not the only sand in the gears. There were lots of sand in the gears. Everyone had a slightly different view of how this remake of Penn Station might work. And the result was that because everyone had enough skin in the game to veto the whole process, nothing could get done. So the thing that was the sort of the epiphany moment for me at the beginning of this book was that we'd gone from one sort of political system where one single figure could do things no matter how bad they were, to a different one where almost no one could get something done no matter how good it was. And I wanted to understand, because I didn't at the time, what had changed. So that gets that was a big question you asked me, and it was probably a pretty long answer. So I should let you guys cut in before I continue to talk.
Okay, that I think combines also. It's kind of epitomizes this very, now as you call it, like an awkward marriage, a yin yang between. Mm-hmm. This is a product of Hamiltonian blue ribbon commissions and Jeffersonian public referenda, basically.
Yeah.
Looking at the modern stage of the progressive left, it seems we're constantly then making these trade-offs. We can't accomplish object A at the cost of object B that might be criticized, both of which will help goal C, but we can't get anything done. What is the kind of rubric then that you propose? I mean, we can look at Moses, for example, and say, not the biblical figure, but
sort of
in some ways, yes.
Yeah, right.
Like, clearly he had less regard for ethics and more for getting shit done, but he got shit done at the end.
Yes. So let me just take a step back, because for a listener, the basic rubric of my thinking is that Moses epitomizes a Hamiltonian approach, meaning that it's a big centralized bureaucracy that can make all sorts of decisions on the public's behalf in the public interest, theoretically, and it ends up being that Moses himself is so powerful that he's able to reshape the landscape of New York City sort of on a whim at his own discretion, without really thinking about the implications for the people, for the little people who actually live there. And at the other end is this Jeffersonian ethos, which is, oh my gosh, like there are men like Moses out there. We need to put up all sorts of veto points so that the little people who actually live in the city have actually some agency to protect themselves against the sort of the alien UFO that's going to come down and cast a shadow and remake the city in its at its discretion. And that we've gone from one extreme, the Jeffersonian extreme during the Moses era, to the other extreme, the Jeffersonian. We've gone from a Hamiltonian extreme to a Jeffersonian extreme, and that's neither of these extremes is ideal. Right? Like, in the same, I guess we're on a SPIA podcast, so I can say this in slightly more academic terms. Like, we have we have a liberal democracy, meaning that we have a democracy, we have majority rule in this country, but everyone has their own personal liberties. So that makes it liberal as opposed to illiberal. And so you've got some combination of, 51% of America could vote theoretically to send the other 49% off the island, but personal liberties prevent them from doing that. At the same time, we don't want to have a situation where everyone has so many liberties that the government is incapable of taxing people so that we can solve various tragedies of the common, installing sewer systems or transportation systems or parks or enough housing or electricity grids, what have you. And what's essentially happened is that we had a little bit too much democracy in some ways when Robert Moses ruled the roost, in the sense that he had this sort of exclusive control over the levers of government. And now we've gone to the other extreme, where liberty is so spread that you can't solve big problems. So you get to a problem like the orchid problem we were talking about earlier, of the only way to green the grid in Massachusetts is to pull clean energy from someplace that isn't in Massachusetts. And so you need to build a transmission line. And a transmission line is by definition going to destroy or impinge upon the land beneath it. And there are all sorts of options. You could try to dig it all, which would be extremely expensive, and make sure that the clean energy is not competitive economically with cheap fossil fuel energy. Or you could try to try to build this line through this a bit of forest. And we've the thing that Robert Moses had was the discretion to decide, and the thing that the system today does not have is that discretion. Because there's so many rules, almost anybody can veto anything. So there's nobody who can say these orchids are not worth 700,000 more pollutant-emitting cars on the street.
Okay, in this perfect world then where vetoing is no longer an issue, vetocracy is gone, the ideal guardrails look like what is the question also? You mentioned also running into these same kinds of obstacles with rolling out electric vehicles and their chargers.
Yeah.
And there's so many rules that mandate its construction and its placement. Does it require then less of the kind of small print legal and more of the we trust that you will also prioritize these broader abstract values? How do we kind of give people the discretion to decide, but also monitor that they don't make really awful decisions as opposed to what we consider smaller trade-offs?
Well, that is the $100,000 or $100 billion question. How do we figure out some way to balance the Hamiltonian and the Jeffersonian extremes? And the point of my book is really just to point out that these extremes exist. That this is not the story that progressives like to tell themselves is that we have good ideas. We want to green things. We want women to have the right to choose. We've got a whole agenda. We want social justice and economic equality and all these things. And the thing that's stopping us is the sort of the nefarious influence of the right or the conservatives or MAGA or Republicans or what you sort of name your villain. And I'm trying to argue to progressives, we are ourselves conflicted between these two ideas about how tough decisions should be made. We've seen both extremes, and we have abhorred the results. We hated Robert Moses, certainly after The Power Broker came out. We did not like the idea that some middle-aged white man in a gray suit and a fedora would be able to move entire communities of minority or poor people to have to scatter because he decided to put new housing there for wealthy whites or to build a highway. We didn't like that. And we now don't like the fact that government can't get anything done. And that between these two extremes, there has to be some sort of balance that allows for people who are really, truly, potentially going to be victimized by some project that solves something for the common good, the opportunity to express in a real way their concerns such that they might in fact determine the outcome. Because, orchids don't seem that important, but a whole community of immigrants who have nowhere else to go, maybe that is a reason not to do a big project. By the same token, once it seems as if we see the benefits and they so far outweigh the costs, it needs to be the government can accomplish something expeditiously. And in our ordinary lives, we all make decisions that have trade-offs all the time, right? I want to see my friends. I haven't seen them in forever, but I need to study for this test, right? Or I really want this donut, but it's probably not going to do me any favors when I have to run the mile an hour later. And so we are constantly making judgments like this. Government is at the moment incapable of doing these trade-offs. That is the problem that we're trying to solve for, is that government, faced with a bunch of options that have upsides and downsides, can't seem to weigh them and sort of put orchids versus emissions and say, what is the more important priority here? What ought we to do? And now that we've made that decision, let's embrace it and just get the project done.
I like the presidential fitness test shout out, by the way, for Mile Run.
I'm noticing a very important undercurrent with all that you're talking about that you brought up yesterday. Would you be willing to speak about the topic of eminent domain? You mentioned that you had originally dedicated a section of your book to that topic, and then something happened. Could you talk to us about that?
Well, what happened was I had an editor who didn't think that section was additive to the overall story. That material will come out at some point when I looked at it again. The eminent domain is just the process that government uses when it needs to claim someone's property, and there's a guarantee in the Constitution that you will be properly compensated if your private property is assumed by the government, and it was used with great alacrity in the post-war years when America was building, and we would when we were building the highway system, like those were networks. That land where there are now expressways was privately owned, and often the government would go to the owner of that land and say, "Well, I'll buy it. We'll buy it for you for this amount," and they would negotiate something, and it would get done. And then the reason that the negotiations were often successful was that the presumption was that if the owner refused the government's offer, they would go through a legal process called eminent domain, by which the government would take control and then pay potentially less than they had originally offered. Eminent domain was probably used too extensively during those post-war decades, so that people felt like they were sort of always under the specter of the man coming and claiming their land. Is that a good Gen Z term? Does Gen Z say the man? And then it sort of there's a law passed in the mid-'70s that sort of, it's called the Uniform Act, that severely restricts the use of eminent domain. And then there's a famous law case, a Supreme Court case called Kelo, I believe, in which the use of eminent domain by governments to do something like economic development is curtailed. The merits of that case, or of using eminent domain generally, like, is just sort of one small element of a broader effort begun, I think, in the late 60s, early 70s, that continues today on the left of saying, of embracing a narrative which says government is coming for you. They're coming for your land. They're coming for your prosperity. You need to be protected against the government, which is not like when we think of what does it mean to be a progressive, it's generally like we want the government to do these things for people who cannot do for themselves. And I think in many cases progressives don't realize within themselves that they have both of these narratives. They sort of flip back and forth between them. Like, we're frightened of government. We're frightened of the bureaucrat that would tell a woman what to do with her body. We're frightened of the boss hog.
I don't hear that one frequently.
You don't hear boss hog? But there was a remake of what's Boss Hog from? Boss Hog is from Dukes of Hazzard. Wasn't there? No?
I'm so sorry, over my head.
This is
I know Spinal Tap 2 came out this week.
No. All right. You guys, I feel like when I was young, there was a whole thing about Daisy Dukes. That doesn't mean anything? It's probably not. That may not be PG. Okay.
Undergrads.
Anyway, okay. So Boss Hog was the sort of was a character on a television show popular in the 70s and 80s. Where there were sort of some rebellious, young, handsome men who were always sticking their fingers in the eyes of the law in some southern county, and Boss Hog was the county judge who was a fool and drove around in the backseat of a big Cadillac with a big hat, and like that image, that show reflected sort of a broader cultural narrative about sort of the lethargy, stupidity, power-hungry, not actually interested in the public interest government, and how are we going to protect people from that? And I think people still have that narrative, and that's why we have all of these Jeffersonian protections to protect against Boss Hog or the Jim Crow laws or Robert Moses or Richard Daley was a famous mayor of Chicago. And now we've done so much of that we would now speak out of the same mouths, say we need government to do these big things, to provide more housing, to provide more clean energy, to make it so that we have a faster train between these two places or whatnot. And the government can't do it because of all the protections we have to prevent Boss Hogg or Robert Moses from doing bad things. And so the entire, like, if I could sum up the book in all, it's basically wake up progressives, right? Like, note that you are internally conflicted between these two impulses, and we need to find some balance of the two so that people, and what's the podcast is called? Punchline Politics?
Policy Punchline?
Policy Punchline. So my punchline is going to be that people should have a voice without a veto, that we ought not to be doing what Robert Moses did, which was to turn a deaf ear to all the people that his various machinations were going to affect. Those people should have the ability to speak to Robert Moses, to what authority is actually making the decision about whether we build the highway or the new right-of-way for the high-speed rail or the new housing project or the new park or the new sewer system or whatever it is. But that they, just because you live there doesn't mean that you should be able to veto some project that could have vast benefits for lots of other people. And we just need to have some system that balances these two priorities.
I like that. Voice without a veto. It's very pithy.
I'm looking for tattoo ideas. Don't tell my parents.
It's a good one. I want to zoom out a little bit. That's a really good final punchline, I think, for the book itself. Clearly, you've done a lot of this research. The more that you're digging, the more you realize this problem. But the impulse to identify progressives as having this kind of contradictory instinct comes, I'm sure, also as a product of your illustrious political background in D.C. Walk us through maybe one or two of those more personal examples where you've struggled with that or you've interfaced it. Maybe this has to do with your former boss, Anthony Weiner, or anyone else in politics in the early 2000s. Curious what your initial thoughts might be on that.
I will say that when I was working for a think tank in D.C. maybe 15 years ago, it was during the Bush years, and Democrats were largely out of power. And these poobahs who had been involved in electing Bill Clinton to office in the 1990s were sort of sitting around sort of almost perplexed about how it was that, in their view, Clinton's presidency had been so successful and we'd gotten so many things done and balanced the budget, and the economy had been, gangbusters. I think that can't be a Gen Z term, but I'm going to use it anyway. And why was it that sort of people had turned away from that model of politics? And I sort of recognized at a certain point that they were sort of on a merry-go-round of explanations, the filibuster, money in politics, gerrymandering, and that none of these institutions by themselves were new. Like Elbridge Gerry, for whom gerrymander is named,
right.
was James Madison's vice president. Like it wasn't like we began rewriting legislative districts to benefit incumbents in the late 20th century, like money in politics. If you read any of Robert Caro's other books, after he did The Power Broker, he started on like a lifelong quest to understand Lyndon Baines Johnson. And LBJ, his power came from money that he controlled by independent oil producers in Texas, and he used that money to amass power in Washington. The filibuster rules hadn't really changed. They have since, but the filibuster became more prevalently used not because of a change in the actual rules that govern the Senate, but because the alacrity with which a senator would choose to filibuster a bill, which had been pretty unheard of, like when Strom Thurmond filibustered for then a record number of hours the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that was really an unusual thing for a senator to do, and the rules hadn't changed, but per se some of the nuances had changed, but the core rule hadn't changed. It was just that the senators were more likely to use that lever of their power. And so I wanted to understand what was sort of at the root of those, like what was the real deal. And that was sort of the impetus for my first book, but it applies as well to the second in the sense that I didn't like, it starts from a place of authentic ignorance, right? Like I'm sitting there reading The Power Broker on the train to New York, and like I really didn't understand what had changed. And it's what's interesting to me is like not long ago, maybe in the 50th anniversary of the Power Broker's publication last year, like people were still saying, if you really want to understand power, you need to read this book. And all the pundits in New York have the Power Broker on their bookshelves behind them when they're doing interviews on MSNBC or whatnot. And what's so remarkable to me is that the world that Caro is exploring in the Power Broker, the world of New York politics in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, is just wildly different from the world that we inherit today, largely because of the Power Broker. Like it's not as if people read that book and then didn't do anything. They did a lot of stuff. And like there's Watergate, and there was Vietnam, and there was this counterculture, and there was the anti-war movement, and there was right. There was the second wave feminism. Like there were a whole bunch of things that spurred and reshaped the progressive agenda. And now we're dealing with the repercussions of that turn. So I don't know if that directly answers your question, but that's the evolution of where the book comes from. Mm-hmm. And I worked in Washington for whatever it was, 15, 20 years, and everyone was constantly asking, like, why don't things work? And this is ultimately my attempt to answer that.
I might ask one more question on this topic. And
hit me.
It combines, I think, the conclusions, or maybe the topics at least, of both of the books that you've now written. And I was lucky enough, first of all, to chat with David Leonhardt a few months ago about mm-hmm. his recent book, which gets the same problems of a more individualistic, like move fast and break things mentality, where we can't actually rely on each other in our community to make that change, to galvanize in certain ways. I'm looking at this article about you, maybe written with you, I can't totally tell, from 2017 in the State Journal Register about missing out on the kindness of strangers. Mm-hmm. And your grandfather was a salesperson. He doesn't trust the Yelp reviews to find good restaurants. Yeah. He likes to find good-natured people and get their advice. Right. I think that's a great MO, personally. While we're waiting for the removal of this vetocracy, can't seem to get that word out. I'm curious, what maybe on a smaller level, on a community level, can we be doing to repatch the social fabric, to restore faith in our ability to get things done, period? Yeah.
So I think that nothing would have given my late grandfather, Mel Dunkelman, greater pleasure than knowing that he was the subject of conversation on a Princeton University podcast 11 years after his passing. So I'm glad that you found that old article. There are you're right to identify that there are two elements here. One is one are the institutions, like sort of the institutions we use to solve problems. And the argument of this new book, Why Nothing Works, is that our institutions have changed so that power flows in a different way that makes it easier for people to stop things from moving. The second is, like, what are our own proclivities ourselves? Like, are we sympathetic to the people that live near us? Do we know what their concerns are? Do we care? I had a really interesting conversation with a woman who, Sonia Trouse is her name, and she's the subject of a really great book called Golden. It's by Connor Daughtry. Golden Gates is the name of the book, and it's about the housing fight in California, the fight to get more housing. And Sonia starts going to meetings in San Francisco, which are, community board meetings or zoning meetings where people are proposing new housing, and all the neighbors come out and scream, no, this is going to ruin the character of the neighborhood. And Sonia, in sort of a masterly way, comes to these meetings and says, I want this. I want this building. Like, I don't think that our kids are going to be able to live here in San Francisco with us unless there's more housing, because there's so much demand and not enough supply. And she sort of begins the NIMBY movement, yes, in my backyard. So I met her not that long ago, and she said to me something that had never occurred to me, which was, I think your two books are connected. And I said, like the one book was a decade before the other. That was about how communities changed in America. This is about how institutions. And she said, well, my experience in California is that in communities where people are really tied together, they know each other, they love each other, like they bowl in leagues, to use Robert Putnam's phrase, that they're connected. They meet at the PTA, they say hello to each other on the street, they are actually connected. Those communities are much more willing to build new housing. Like when you go to a community meeting in a community like that, they think to themselves, well, we want our kids to move here when they graduate from college or from high school, or what. We want them to stay here. We want them to be able to be here, and we are willing. Like, this is a cost that we're willing to pay more traffic, more people on the sidewalk, whatever, so that we can so that the community will evolve and accommodate more people. Whereas people who move into bedroom communities, or move to suburbs, or move to a town where no one knows each other, one house to the next, like, they are not invested in the spirit of community, and they are much more likely to be NIMBYs, because they bought into this thing. That's the thing that they wanted. They don't know their neighbors. They just want to be left alone. And so, like, that was sort of a profound. It was a profound. Like, I had never made that connection until Sonia made it for me. And so, the spirit of my first book came from the fact that my first dog of blessed memory, Artie, and I used to walk around a neighborhood in Washington, DuPont Circle, every morning. And it was that neighborhood is what you know it, because you're from D.C., but it's what new urbanists sort of see as Shangri-La, because it's townhouses, it's density, it's people sort of on their front porches and walking along streets, and it's pedestrian friendly, and bikes and all the things that sort of urban design geeks want.
Shout out street closures for farmers markets.
Exactly right. Great farmers market. But I found that when I lived there in a cut-up townhouse, when Artie and I walked around the same blocks, generally the same time every morning, I never said hello to people. And it may be that I have a particularly unfriendly-looking face, or that my golden doodle was particularly vicious, which he was not. He was not a scary-looking dog. But that the architecture by itself doesn't determine the tenor of the neighborhood. And so, the original article that spurred that first book was sort of suggesting that there were sort of new urbanist ways to remake America. If we just had the right architecture, people would come together and talk more. And I think there's something more to it than that. I think maybe there are ways that architecture can steer us, but Jonathan Haidt has a new book out about sort of the
anxious generation.
The anxious generation, the degree to which we have our AirPods in, the degree to which we're more engaged in ephemeral relationships on social media than we are with real relations in person. We're doing online gaming rather than joining.
Your former boss might know a little bit about that too.
You really want to get it?
Sorry.
No.
Not pushing.
Well, they sort of are pushing, but that's
pushing.
Okay.
My bad.
No. I mean, if you've got specific questions about him, I'm happy to answer.
We're definitely getting into your middle circle by now.
Yeah. But the essence of it is, are there ways that we can encourage people to have more face-to-face interaction to get to know their neighbors in a more substantive way? I think that's a big part of it, and having free range parents in the which is I think a new phrase in my world, which is the sort of notion that we've been nervous to let our two daughters sort of run wild in Providence where we live. And we should let them sort of explore on their own and take risks, and that's how you sort of learn to grow up and handle danger. And we've coddled them. I think there's probably something to that, and that would be one of the things that I would recommend.
I'm very glad that you brought up the connection that your friend mentioned between the two books, because I meant to ask you. You speak about how the shift towards the Jeffersonian side that has led to the bureaucracy that makes things impossible in contemporary politics comes from, at least at the start, a distrust of the elites that you describe, wearing top hats and all that. Mm-hmm. Do you... Fedoras, my bad. Sorry, fedoras.
Yeah. And flannel suits.
And flannel suits. Gray flannel suits, right?
I got it written right there.
All right.
So you do or you do not think that is linked to the degradation of the middle ring at all?
Well, now this is a pop quiz. I think that when it turned out that the old establishment in their fedoras and gray flannel suits were not pursuing, the members of the establishment were not necessarily pursuing the public interest in the way that people expected. They were not the apolitical sort of I'm just going to do the right thing because I've been tasked with that, and they made grave mistakes. We lost an element of social trust. That those mistakes both spurred us to put new vetoes into the system, institutionally. We created veto points. We created the National Environmental Protection Act, so that we would have environmental impact studies that would stop Robert Moses from doing the most destructive things he might want to do, building a new highway. And now we created that. And that those institutional barriers have now become so oppressive that people don't see government responding to their needs. And so that's driven down social trust. I think at the same time, the reaction in much of the progressive community to the realization that Robert McNamara had sent boys off to die in Vietnam, and that Robert Moses has destroyed the South Bronx, and that the big ag companies were throwing chemicals on our plants that were causing birth defects, right? Was sort of a back to the land, sort of commune-looking counterculture that existed for sort of second there in the 60s and 70s, where there's sort of a real effort to build community that was separate and apart from the prevailing sort of American society. So there's a famous movie, Network, and the tagline of that, which maybe we can make the tagline of this, or the punchline of this, was a guy who's people should watch it. But the tagline is a guy yelling, "I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore." And that was sort of the feeling in the mid-'70s. People were mad as hell. The establishment wasn't working. They're not going to take it anymore. And there have been sort of waves of reactions to that, one of which was briefly this sort of back to the land. But more broadly was a decline in faith in sort of the broader society. How do you sort of bring more of your attention, focus, and love into the people that you trust and know best, who I would call the inner ring, your inner rings in the first book, the Vanishing Neighbor. But the be all and end all is that while 80% of Americans had faith that government would do the right thing in the 1960s, we're now in the 20s. That's a big drop off, and I think it's a reflection both of what's happened to us interpersonally and a reaction to the fact that the government, which used to be responsive to needs, which purportedly saved us from the Great Depression and prevented, the fascism from running over Europe and Asia, no longer is equipped to do the ordinary things right. Everyone at the dinner I was at last night was saying that if you move to New Jersey today and you have an out-of-state license, like it's like 6 hours to the DMV to get for, and just it's just like how hard can that be? I already have a license in New York State. Why does it take me 6 hours to just switch it when I've moved to New Jersey? And we don't trust government to do big things because it does small things so poorly. And if those of us who are progressive want government to solve these big problems, we need to actually be more focused on making sure that little things are get done expeditiously and well.
Okay, we're moving into our final questions now. Off of what you just said, maybe it's lack of trust in government. Maybe it's the fact that consulting and investment banks are so good at recruiting students at these schools so early. But there's clearly a disinterest for kids in SPIA, for kids everywhere, to end up working in government right out of college. I think maybe people are convinced the bureaucracy they won't be able to fix in time to accomplish anything. There's certainly a disillusionment, though, with government work. You were so good yesterday at isolating problems that our generation is uniquely capable of and tasked with fixing. What do you recommend? Is it that we need more people who treat government like a business and enter UV space in government like CEOs so that they can bulldoze the orchids respectfully and get things done? Or what is the MO? Maybe a second question to this, though I know it's a lot, is are there key pedagogical disciplines to focus on, you think, in undergrad that will uniquely equip us to solve these problems later?
So those are excellent questions. Let me just put it to you this way. When Robert Moses was the most powerful man in New York, he had sort of a cabal of supporters and people who worked for him who were known as the Moses Men. And the Moses Men also probably wore gray suits and fedoras. And they were engineers. And they worked in the public sector because it was incredibly satisfying, right? Like they could show their grandchildren they knew, I designed and built that playground that millions of children have used. I designed and built that bridge. I participated in these things that I got done. And so those people, those Moses Men, probably could have gotten more lucrative positions in the private sector, but chose to spend their lives working for these various public authorities that had all this power. And that since then, if you are a lawyer or an engineer or a public policy specialist and you go to work for the Environmental Protection Agency and you propose a rule that's going to somehow benefit the environment by reducing emissions of some carcinogenic chemical or preserve water, like you name it, what happens is you propose a rule, the members of Congress excoriate you either for being too sympathetic to the polluters or insufficiently cognizant of what the economic implications will be of this rule. You'll get raked over the coals by members of Congress on both sides. You'll then be sued by both the advocates who are trying to save the environment and the companies that don't like the rule. And by the end of it, it's quite possible that nothing will happen, or you will just sort of live there in fear of spending 10 years of your life in this bureaucratic morass of litigation and fights between the various branches of government when you went into the thing you wanted to do good. And it won't not only have you given up the economic opportunity of going to work for some big bank or whatever it is, but you didn't give it up for the satisfaction of knowing that you had a great imprint on the world. You gave it up for basically just frustration. And so my advice to you is to be thinking about these things. What is the world how should the world work? Who should be able to decide things? I would like you and your generation to be thinking, what is the generation that came out of the Second World War really believed in the establishment. They'd seen the establishment work. They defeated the Nazis. They helped the country overcome the Depression. They really believed in them. The subsequent generation, that would go on to write the Port Huron Statement in the early 60s and then become members of SDS, and they did not. And both of those generations had clear views of how power should be wielded and fought for them. Your generation, I think, is coming at a moment where we are, for the first time since maybe the 70s, having a real sort of can I say this on a Princeton project? A come to Jesus moment with how progressives think about power. And I would like you to be thinking holistically about, I want to make this impression on the world. How do the institutions that govern that way policy is made work? And beyond saying, I'm going to go work at this nonprofit that wants more affordable housing or more green energy or more better engineering or whatever it is, think, what are the sort of government reforms that we need to do to make it so that we can have a world where people have a voice without a veto? That sounds, I think, a little fanciful at the moment, but I mean, at the moment that progressivism was born in the early 20th century and the Lochner Court was basically telling government that it couldn't do things, it would have sounded preposterous to reformers at that time that just a few decades on, there'd be this guy named Robert Moses who was so powerful in New York that he could step through courts, right? It didn't matter. At the time that Robert Moses was so powerful and was the sort of the face of the establishment, it would have been impossible to imagine that someone would make reforms such that no Robert Moses character could exist at all, because anyone could veto any of his projects. So now we're at a moment where it feels like what are we possibly going to do so that American government works again and we can actually make progress on things? And I think decades from now, there will be a new regime. It will be the brainchild of people in your generation. You will be working in the world that you have created, and you should begin thinking about it proactively now. Like how, we live in Dayton or DC or Barcelona or LA or New Hampshire. What is the decision-making process we should embrace in this place so that we can solve tragedy of the common without people feeling as if they've been completely dispossessed of their voice? And I don't there's no formulaic thing to do there, but it is thinking about that way. You'll look at a problem and you'll say, oh, well, clearly the mayor should choose that, or clearly the Public Service Commission should choose that. And once they choose it, it shouldn't be endless litigation effort. It will make sense. If you look at problems through this prism, through this prism, I think that there will be things that you see as obvious reforms. And I think that frustrated progressives, as angry as they are about the fact that they live in a world that right now is dominated by MAGAism, are going to embrace common sense reforms. I just on the left, the right, there are people who have lots of criticisms of the abundance agenda and whatnot. But when you talk to them about shouldn't someone have been able to pick building the power line that was going to take 700,000 carbon emitting cars off the road each year in place of an orchid? Most of them will be like, yeah, we should have a system that allows us to do that. And if you are for single payer health care, right, and you have a big government vision, as many on the left do, let's make it so that when you're changing your driver's license from New York to New Jersey, it doesn't take 6 hours, because otherwise who wants the government to have a bigger role in provisioning healthcare? So this feels to me like it's actually low-hanging fruit. It's just that we need your generation to think about it and actually advocate on behalf of making things work.
For the sake of common sense.
Yes, a voice without a veto for the sake of common sense.
Any more questions, Eli?
I'll leave it to you, Maddie.
All right. Well, I like your pithy closeouts. Voice without a vote. We also got what was the lament from the 70s? I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore.
Mad as hell and I'm not gonna, from Network. Yeah.
From Network. Any final words? Let's say you're at the table in Project 2029 discussions. What's your first order of business besides getting rid of the vetocracy?
I guess, well, this would be slightly controversial. I think that progressives spend too much time trying to vilify Trump and trying to convince people that he's bad, and not enough time articulating how our vision would be beneficial. So I think people are rightfully frustrated with government. Their frustrations are born often from things that we have done, that we should own that and fix it. And that is time better spent than calling out the latest outrage from the White House.
Well said. Thank you so much, Marc, for joining us today, for walking us through a lot of these ideas. That concludes today's episode of Policy Punchline. We're so grateful to you and to our listeners for tuning in.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Marc.
Thanks.
You've been listening to Policy Punchline, a podcast generously supported by the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance at Princeton University. Policy Punchline is intended to be informational only and does not reflect nor represent the views of Princeton University or the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance. For more information on subscription, donation, volunteering, or contact, please visit policypunchline.com. Thank you again for listening.